The low, predatory rumble of an expensive engine vibrated through the thin walls of Kathy's apartment exactly 23 minutes after she had pressed send. She pulled back the frayed curtain, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched a sleek black Mercedes sedan glide to the curb. It sat there like a dark gemstone dropped into the cracked concrete and shadows of her neighborhood, utterly and dangerously out of place. When the door opened, Park Woo-jin emerged into the dim streetlights. He was exactly as she remembered him from the catering gig, yet entirely different in this context, dressed in a tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. He carried an aura of such absolute, controlled power that Kathy's breath hitched. His intense, dark eyes scanned the crumbling facade of her building with a clinical coldness. Behind him, an older man followed, clutching a professional medical bag with practiced ease. In that moment, the desperation that had fueled her 2 a.m. text was replaced by a cold, jarring realization. She had reached out for a lifeline and accidentally caught a shark. She had made a terrible mistake. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. Are you Team Kathy or Team Woo-jin? Let's talk. Now let's dive in. The heavy thud of footsteps echoed in the hallway before the knock came, firm and unhurried. When she opened the door, Woo-jin didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the cramped space, his presence immediately making the room feel smaller, more fragile. But as his gaze shifted from the peeling wallpaper to the bed where 7-year-old Marcus lay shaking with fever, the hardness in his expression fractured. Something shifted, a brief, unreadable softening in his eyes as he took in the boy's labored breathing. "Start the assessment," Woo-jin commanded, his voice a low, melodic rasp. The doctor moved instantly, but as he began to work, it was Kathy who stepped into the light. Despite the terror clawing at her throat, her instincts as a former pre-med student took over. She didn't hover. She assisted. She reported Marcus's peak temperature, the duration of his symptoms, and the specific progression of the infection using precise medical vocabulary that made the doctor pause in surprise. Throughout the examination, Woo-jin did not move. He stood back in the shadows of the small room, his arms crossed, watching her. He noted the way her hands remained steady even as her eyes welled with tears, and the way she anticipated the doctor's needs before he could ask. He wasn't just watching a mother in distress. He was observing a woman whose competence remained unshakable even as her world was collapsing. Marcus's breathing finally leveled out, the rattling cough replaced by the soft, rhythmic puffing of healing sleep. The Dr. Woo-jin had began packing his leather bag, his movements silent and clinical, leaving Kathy alone with the man who had answered a stranger's midnight prayer. She stood by the bed, her hands still trembling as she smoothed the hair back from her son's damp forehead, acutely aware of the powerful presence looming near the doorway. "I'll have the $50 for you by Friday," she whispered, her voice cracking with the remnants of her panic. "I can set up a payment plan for the doctor's visit, too. I don't know what your rates are, but I'll find a way to make it right." Woo-jin didn't move. He leaned against the doorframe of her cramped bedroom, his tailored black suit a stark, dark contrast against the peeling floral wallpaper. "I don't want your $50, Kathy James," he said softly. The way he spoke her full name made her spine stiffen. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her maternal instincts flaring into a new kind of alarm. "I make it a point to know who is handling my events," he replied, his dark eyes tracking her every movement with unsettling intensity. "I know you were 3 years into a pre-med degree at Temple before you had to walk away. I know Marcus's father isn't in the picture. And I know that tonight, while most people would have sat in an ER waiting room for 10 hours, you were ready to perform a triage myself if you had to." He stepped closer, his aura of controlled power filling the small space. He wasn't looking at her with pity. It was something closer to professional appraisal. "I have a private facility," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, careful tone that circled the true nature of his world. "It requires someone with medical expertise who understands the value of discretion and the necessity of survival. I need a medical director." Kathy glanced at Marcus, then back at the man whispered to be the architect of a shadowed empire. What kind of facility? The kind that pays a salary of $120,000, Wu Jin stated calmly. It includes comprehensive health coverage for your son and a trust for his private education. You would be responsible for the care of my associates and their families. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of an unspoken price. Kathy looked at the flickering light of her rundown apartment and then at the steady rise and fall of her son's chest. She knew she was being offered a golden cage, a way out of poverty that led directly into the dark. "Why me?" she asked. Wu Jin's expression softened almost imperceptibly as he watched her. "Because you're a survivor, Kathy. And in my world, that is the only currency that matters." The black Mercedes glided through the tree-lined streets of Rittenhouse Square, stopping before a majestic four-story brownstone. Inside, the building was a revelation of glass and cold steel, housing surgical suites with high-end diagnostic equipment that rivaled any university hospital where Kathy had once studied. The sterile scent of antiseptic was a sharp contrast to the crumbling walls of her own apartment. Park Woo-jin stood by a wall of monitors, his presence commanding and dark against the clinical white of the room. He was blunt about the reality of the facility. She would be treating his employees and their families. No questions asked, regardless of how they were injured. "You will save the lives of people who have taken lives," he stated, his voice devoid of judgment. He offered her the role of medical director with a salary of $120,000, promising that her son Marcus would receive the best healthcare and education money could buy. Kathy felt the weight of the moral compromise, yet she looked him in the eye, her medical principles remaining her only armor. She demanded 3 non-negotiable conditions. No children harmed by his organization would ever be brought to her. No victims of human trafficking would be silenced in her wards, and she would maintain absolute medical autonomy over every patient. To her surprise, Wu Jin agreed immediately, without a single moment of negotiation. He watched her with an intensity she didn't yet fully understand. He had been searching for a woman exactly like her. Someone with elite skills and an unshakable moral compass, but who also had everything to lose. By securing Marcus's future, he wasn't just hiring a doctor. He was ensuring her loyalty. Kathy was competent and principled, which made her valuable. But it was her love for her son that truly made her controllable. In his, the sterile scent of antiseptic usually acted as a shield for Kathy, a familiar boundary between her clinical duties and her messy, complicated life. But as she settled into her role at the private brownstone clinic, that boundary began to blur. Her days were defined by the unexpected rhythm of Park Woo-jin's visits. He arrived frequently, ostensibly to review the facility's operations or check the intake of injured employees. Yet his presence always lingered long after the business was concluded. Between the surgical suites and the high-end equipment that dwarfed anything she'd seen at Temple University, they found a strange, quiet middle ground. Their conversations, once strictly professional, began to drift into the personal. Wu Jin proved to be a man of calculated contradictions. While Kathy saw the cold, ruthless efficiency he used to manage his syndicate, she also saw him arrive with carefully chosen books and educational gifts for Marcus. He never overstepped his bounds as a benefactor, but the genuine interest he showed in her son's welfare began to erode her reflexive distrust. She watched him closely, fascinated by the duality of the man known as the architect. To the world, he was a brutal crime lord. To her son, he was the man who ensured he had the best healthcare and a future free from the suffocating grip of poverty. One evening, as the dim, warm light of the clinic created a rare moment of stillness, Kathy finally asked the question that had haunted her since that first desperate night. "Why did you come?" she asked, her voice steady despite the weight of the inquiry. "You could have ignored a text from a stranger asking for $50. Wu Jin didn't look away. He admitted he had noticed her months earlier during a catering event at his restaurant. He hadn't responded to a random plea. He had been watching her, waiting for an opportunity to bring someone of her specific capabilities, her medical knowledge, her fierce maternal instinct, and her unshakable determination, into his world. He hadn't just saved Marcus, he had been searching for her. In the quiet of the clinic, Kathy realized that while she had been trying to secure her son's future, she had become a vital part of a much darker, more powerful design. The rhythmic beep of the vitals monitor was the only sound in the sterile suite until the first explosion of glass shattered the silence. 3 months into her role as medical director, Kathy James had grown accustomed to the shadow world's injuries, but she had never heard the visceral roar of a breach. She was deep in the delicate task of extracting a lead slug from a young syndicate member's thigh when the facility's front perimeter disintegrated under a hail of gunfire. The young man on the table jerked, his eyes wide with primal terror as bullets whistled through the upper windows, showering the surgical floor in crystalline shards. Kathy's assistants dove for cover, but she remained anchored to the table. Her medical training, the years at Temple she thought she'd thrown away, surged to the forefront, manifesting as a cold, clinical detachment. If she let go of the artery now, the boy would bleed out before the gunman even reached the door. "Stay down," she commanded her patient, her voice cutting through the cacophony. She leaned her body over his, using herself as a shield while her steady hands continued to work the forceps. The hallway outside erupted into a brief, brutal symphony of return fire. She recognized the precise, rhythmic percussion of Park Woo-jin's security team. When the door finally kicked open, it wasn't a rival gunman who entered, but Woo-jin himself. He looked like a dark god of war, his tailored suit jacket discarded, a weapon held with practiced ease. He stopped dead at the sight of her. Kathy, drenched in copper-scented blood, her light-colored scrubs a ruin of stains, still suturing the wound as if the world weren't ending around them. The gunfire subsided into a heavy, ringing silence. Instead of collapsing or seeking comfort, Kathy tied off the final stitch and stepped away from the table. She didn't tremble. She moved immediately to the doorway, her eyes scanning the hallway with the sharp, calculating gaze of a field medic. "Status?" she demanded, her voice flat and professional. She began moving from one fallen man to the next, establishing triage with the same efficiency she used to manage a dinner rush at the diner. Woo-jin watched her, the protective instinct he'd arrived with cooling into something much sharper. Profound respect. He had brought her into his world because she was skilled and vulnerable, but as she methodically checked a guard's pulse with blood-slicked fingers, he realized his mistake. Kathy James was not a victim to be shielded from the darkness. She was the only one capable of holding a lantern within it. The hum of the industrial ventilation system was the only sound in the shadow clinic, a sterile drone that usually grounded Kathy, but tonight it felt like a low-grade fever. Outside the reinforced glass of her office, 2 men in dark suits stood like statues, new additions to her life that she hadn't requested. Following the breach and the spray of gunfire that had turned her sanctuary into a war zone, Woo-jin had tightened the noose of his protection, assigning personal security to both her and Marcus without a single word of consultation. When Woo-jin finally stepped into the clinic, his presence was as commanding as ever, his dark eyes scanning the room for threats before they settled on her. He didn't wait for her to speak, but Kathy was already moving toward him, her hands trembling not from fear, but from a fierce maternal indignation. "You don't get to decide how my son lives his life, Woo-jin," she said, her voice low and sharp, cutting through the antiseptic air. "I appreciate the safety, but you put guards at his school. You didn't ask. You just acted like he belongs to you." Woo-jin didn't flinch. He stood his ground, the cool calculation of the architect momentarily faltering. "The Kozlovs don't ask for permission before they strike, Kathy. After what happened here, you and Marcus are no longer invisible. And whose fault is that?" she snapped, the argument escalating into a territory they had both avoided for months. "I am a doctor. I was a mother trying to save her son from a fever, not pull him into a turf war." The air between them grew thick, charged with the things they had left unsaid since that first 2 a.m. text. Woo-jin stepped closer, the scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of rubbing alcohol. "You think I want this? Every moment you are in this building, my judgment is compromised. I find myself looking at the monitors instead of the ledgers. I am developing feelings that make me weak, Kathy. Feelings my enemies can smell from a mile away." The admission hung in the air, raw and dangerous. Kathy felt the air leave her lungs. She looked at this man, a ruthless syndicate head who had saved her son's life, but lived a life built on the very violence that had once stolen her partner from her. "I feel it too," she confessed, the guilt finally breaking through her professional veneer. "And it terrifies me. I lie awake wondering if I'm sacrificing my soul for a paycheck, if I'm falling for a man who treats the world like a chessboard. I'm a healer, Wu Jin, but I'm attracted to the man who causes the wounds." The honesty was a different kind of violence, stripping away the roles of boss and employee, savior and survivor. They stood in the center of the empty clinic, two people bound by a desperate beginning and an uncertain future. The tension broke not with more words, but with a silent agreement to stop pretending. Wu Jin reached out, his hand steady as he cupped her face. When he kissed her, it wasn't the polished, controlled gesture of a crime lord. It was a desperate, grounding anchor. Surrounded by the sterile white walls and the weight of the secrets they now shared, Kathy leaned into him. In the silence of the clinic, they finally stopped running from the truth of what they had become to each other. The air inside the private dining room of the Korean restaurant was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the heavy silence of men who lived by the blade. Kathy stood at Park Woo-jin's side, her posture rigid, her 5 feet 6 inches frame feeling much smaller against the imposing presence of the 4 lieutenants seated around the lacquered table. These were the pillars of the Park family syndicate, men who had served Wu Jin for over a decade and whose faces were maps of scars and cold pragmatism. Wu Jin didn't offer a casual introduction. He stood with a hand resting lightly near Kathy's, a gesture of public alignment that sent a ripple of tension through the room. He introduced her not merely as the director of their high-tech shadow clinic, but as a new fixture of his inner circle, a woman whose medical expertise in iron will had already been baptized in the fire of a clinic raid. The response was a fractured mosaic. 3 of the men inclined their heads with a chilling, pragmatic professionalism, recognizing the value of a surgeon who could patch their soldiers under gunfire. But Chul Mu, Wu Jin's oldest associate, sat with his arms crossed, his gaze like flint. He didn't look at Kathy. He looked at Wu Jin, his voice a low, guttural rasp as he spoke in rapid-fire Korean. "She has a son," Chul Mu said, his tone dripping with dismissive certainty. "Children make people predictable, controllable. She'll break the first time someone threatens the boy. She is a liability we cannot afford." He spoke with the arrogance of a man who believed his language was a fortress, assuming the African-American woman before him heard only rhythmic noise. The lieutenants shifted, the air growing colder as they waited for Wu Jin's reaction. Instead, Kathy stepped forward. The years she had spent obsessively studying the language during her late-night pre-med shifts, a secret she had kept even from Wu Jin, coalesced into a sharp, lethal blade. "Then no one should threaten my son," she replied, her Korean fluent and biting. The silence that followed was absolute. Chul Mu's jaw tightened, his eyes widening as the power dynamic in the room shattered and reformed. Kathy didn't flinch. She met his stare with the same unshakable determination she had used to save Marcus's life on a bathroom floor months ago. Beside her, she caught the faint ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of Wu Jin's mouth. He didn't look surprised. In that moment, Kathy realized he hadn't just brought her here to introduce her. He had brought her here to watch her win. He had known about her language skills all along, and as he glanced at Chul Mu, the warning in his dark eyes was clear. The architect had found his partner, and she was far from predictable. The vibration of the phone against the mahogany desk in the clinic's private office felt like a physical strike. Kathy James reached for it, her mind still cataloging the day's surgical supplies. But the image on the screen turned her blood to ice. It was Marcus. Her 7-year-old was standing on the school playground, his bright yellow backpack a beacon against the gray pavement. Superimposed over his small chest was a digital red crosshair. The text beneath it was a cold, clinical demand: "Convince Park to withdraw from the waterfront deal, or next time this won't be photoshopped." For a fraction of a second, the old Kathy, the struggling student who felt suffocated by poverty, wanted to collapse. But the woman who had spent months stitching together the broken bodies of syndicate members under gunfire didn't blink. She didn't run to Wu Jin's office with tears in her eyes. Instead, she opened her laptop, her fingers moving with the steady precision of a surgeon. She traced the digital signature of the message, following the encrypted routing back through the organization's own internal server. It hadn't come from the Kozlov brothers. It had come from within the house. Kathy didn't call for security. She walked straight into the boardroom where the lieutenants were gathered for the afternoon briefing, her heels clicking a rhythmic, lethal tempo against the floor. The room went silent as she entered. Cholmu sat at the far end of the table, his expression one of bored indifference, though his eyes sharpened when he saw her. He was convinced she was a liability, a soft target that would eventually break and betray them all. Kathy didn't wait for an invitation. She tossed her phone onto the center of the table, the image of Marcus and the crosshairs glowing for every man to see. "I know it was you, Cholmu," she said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register that commanded the room. "You used a Kozlov burner, but you were lazy with the internal bounce back." Cholmu leaned back, a smug shadow of a smile playing on his lips. "It was a test, Doctor, to see if you are a weakness to our boss." Kathy slammed her hands onto the table, leaning in until she was inches from his face, her gaze unyielding. The architect's lieutenants watched, frozen, as the woman they considered an outsider reclaimed the room. "Understand this?" she hissed, the maternal fire in her eyes meeting the coldness of his world. "I am not Park's weakness. I am the person standing between you and the consequences of your own stupidity. If anything happens to my son, if so much as a hair on his head is harmed, there won't be enough of this organization left for the police to identify, much less mourn over." She stood tall, looking at each man in turn, her medical coat stained with the day's work and her spirit forged in the very violence they traded in. She wasn't just a mother or a doctor anymore. She was a partner they would learn to fear. The heavy oak doors of the syndicate's inner sanctum creaked shut, sealing out the world and trapping the tension inside. Kathy stood at the head of the table, her gaze leveled at Cholmu with a ferocity that silenced the room. The digital threat against Marcus had stripped away the last of the shadows, forcing the internal fracture into the light. Wu Jin sat at the center, his expression a mask of cold stone as he addressed the violation of the organization's most sacred rule. Family is off limits. The resolution was swift and characteristically brutal. Cholmu was stripped of his rank and removed from power before the other lieutenants could even draw breath. In that moment, Wu Jin didn't just protect Kathy, he elevated her, announcing that she was no longer a hidden asset but his public partner, the bedrock of his empire. 6 months later, the sterile scent of the clinic was replaced by the fragrance of white lilies and traditional Korean incense. The wedding was an impossible bridge between two worlds, held in the very brownstone where their partnership had been forged in blood and antiseptic. Kathy moved through the room in a gown that gracefully blended African-American cultural touches with traditional Korean elements, a physical representation of their united lives. The guest list was a surreal assembly. Kathy's cousins and aunts sat across the aisle from stone-faced syndicate members, all witnessing a union built on the ruins of their former lives. The years that followed transformed that initial 2 a.m. desperation into a legacy. 3 years later, Kathy finally held the medical degree she had once feared was lost forever. She now commanded a network of 5 clinics across Philadelphia, 3 providing essential care to the community and 2 serving the shadowed needs of the syndicate. Marcus, once a shivering boy on a bathroom floor, was now a thriving student at a prestigious private school, his future secured by the very man his mother had accidentally messaged in a moment of panic. As Kathy watched Wu Jin and Marcus together, she realized they had constructed a life that defied every expectation. Their family was an unconventional fortress, built from the bricks of desperation and violence, yet held together by an unshakable, hard-won love. Subscribe to get notified the moment the next chapter drops and follow Kathy and Wu Jin's evolving reign. Comment below with your thoughts. Did Cholmu get what he deserved? Or is there a greater threat looming for Marcus? Let me know your thought under the comments section.